You are lying still, perhaps with your eyes closed or gently unfocused. And somewhere nearby, your phone is resting. It is quiet, not doing anything obvious, not glowing, not making sound. And yet, at this very moment, it could tell you exactly where you are on Earth. Not approximately, not vaguely, but within a few meters. Sometimes even more precisely. This is something we have become used to, so used to, that it barely feels like a question anymore. But if we slow down and look at it carefully, it becomes a very quiet and interesting problem. How does anything know where it is? Before satellites, before electronics, before signals moving at the speed of light, humans still needed to answer this same question. Where am I? And how do I get somewhere else? For most of history, the answer was slow and physical. You would look around and recognize shapes, mountains, rivers, trees. You would remember paths and directions and distances walked. At sea, it became quieter. There were no roads, no landmarks, only the horizon. So people began to look upward. The stars became reference points. Slow, predictable, repeating over long cycles. By measuring angles between the horizon and certain stars, navigators could estimate their position. Not perfectly, but well enough to cross oceans. This method required patience and skill and clear skies. It was a way of locating yourself by observing the world directly. Over time, tools improved. Compasses provided direction. Sextants improved angle measurements. Clocks allowed calculation of longitude. Maps became more accurate, more detailed. But the core idea stayed the same. You compare what you observe with what you already know. And from that comparison, you infer your position. This process always depends on references. Something stable, something known, something outside of you. Now imagine a different kind of reference. Not mountains, not stars as patterns, but precise points moving silently above the earth. Each one carrying a clock. Each one sending signals constantly. Signals that travel invisibly through the air, through clouds, through darkness. Always moving at the same speed. The speed of light. This is the foundation of GPS. Not a map in the usual sense, not a set of directions, but a system built on timing. Very precise timing, measured over extremely small intervals. At first, this may feel abstract, because we do not usually think of position in terms of time. We think in terms of space, distance, direction. But GPS quietly reverses this. It begins with time, and from time, it derives distance. This shift is subtle, but important, because it means that finding where you are does not require seeing anything at all. No landmarks, no stars, no visible reference. Only signals, and the ability to measure when they arrive. Your phone does not look outward in the traditional sense. It listens. Quietly. Continuously. It receives signals from multiple satellites, each one telling a simple story. A timestamp. A moment in time when the signal was sent. Nothing more complicated than that. No message about roads. No description of cities. Just time. From these timestamps, your device begins to build an understanding, not by asking where it is directly, but by asking a quieter question. How long did each signal take to reach me? Because if you know how fast something travels, and you know how long it traveled, then you can know how far it came. This relationship is simple, almost gentle in its simplicity. Distance equals speed multiplied by time. In everyday life, we use this without thinking. If you walk for 1 hour at a steady pace, you can estimate how far you have gone. GPS does the same thing, but at a much smaller scale and with much greater precision. The signals travel at the speed of light, which is about 300,000 kilometers per second. Very fast, almost beyond intuition. So even a tiny difference in time, a fraction of a microsecond, corresponds to a measurable difference in distance. This is where the quiet complexity begins. Because measuring such small intervals of time is not easy. It requires extremely precise clocks and careful coordination. But for now, we can stay with the simple idea. Signals are sent. Signals are received. And the difference between those two moments carries meaning. If one satellite tells you its signal took a certain amount of time to reach you, then you know you are somewhere at a certain distance from that satellite. Not at a single point, but somewhere on a surface, a sphere expanding outward from the satellite. If you listen to more satellites, each one gives you another distance, another sphere. And where these spheres intersect, your position begins to emerge. Slowly, quietly, as if geometry itself is narrowing down the possibilities. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. For now, it is enough to notice something simple. GPS does not tell you where you are in a direct way. It does not point. It does not label. Instead, it provides pieces of information. And from those pieces, your device calculates an answer. This calculation happens quickly, almost instantly from your perspective. But underneath, it is built on layers of reasoning, each step quiet, precise. Another important detail is that GPS is always available, always running, whether you are using it or not. The satellites do not wait for you. They continue broadcasting, continuously, like a steady rhythm. Your device simply joins this rhythm when needed, listening in, gathering signals, and then quietly leaving again. There is no central moment where your location is decided, no single point of awareness. It is a distributed process, spread across space. Satellites in orbit, ground systems on Earth, and your own device, each playing a small role. This makes GPS feel almost invisible, because no single part stands out. Everything works together quietly. If we pause here and return to the original question, how does anything know where it is? We can begin to reshape the answer. It does not know in a human sense. It does not recognize places or remember journeys. Instead, it measures. It compares. It calculates. And from that process, a position appears. This is a different kind of knowing, one based not on perception, but on relationships between time and distance. The world becomes something that can be described through signals and delays and intersections. And yet, all of this remains calm, continuous, and mostly unnoticed. Your phone does not announce each calculation. It simply presents a result. A small blue dot, steady on a map. Behind that dot, there is a constant conversation happening. Not in words, but in signals, moving through space. If you imagine it gently, you might picture the Earth surrounded by a quiet network. Lines of connection, invisible, but always present. Each satellite passing overhead. Each signal traveling downward. Each receiver listening. And somewhere within that network, your position is continuously being resolved. Not stored in the sky, not decided by the satellites, but calculated where you are. This distinction matters because it means GPS is not tracking you in the way people sometimes imagine. The satellites are not watching. They are simply sending. Your device does the rest. So, what we have is a system built on three quiet ideas: signals, time, and geometry. Nothing more dramatic than that. And yet, when combined, they allow for precise positioning anywhere on Earth. This is the foundation we will build on. Slowly, step by step. Because to understand GPS clearly, it helps to begin not with equations, or systems, but with a simple awareness that finding your place in the world can be reduced to measuring how long light takes to reach you. And from there, everything else follows. We can now gently shift our attention upward to the satellites themselves, moving in quiet and predictable paths above the Earth. If you were to step outside and look up at the sky, you would not see it. There is no visible pattern, no faint grid, no markers drifting overhead. The sky would appear as it always does, open, quiet. And yet, above that calm surface, there is a structure, a system moving continuously, a constellation that does not shine. This constellation is made of satellites, small machines placed into orbit around the Earth, each one following a carefully chosen path. Not random, not drifting freely, but moving in predictable loops, repeating the same journey again and again. There are usually at least 24 of these satellites active at any given time, often more, arranged so that no matter where you are on Earth, several of them are always above the horizon. They are not clustered in one place. They are spread out, carefully distributed across different orbital planes. You can think of these planes as tilted rings, circling the Earth, each satellite moving along one of these rings. Together, they form a kind of layered structure, ensuring coverage across the entire surface of the planet. The altitude of these satellites is also important. They orbit at about 20,000 kilometers above the Earth, high enough to see large portions of the surface, but not so far that their signals become too weak. At this height, each satellite completes an orbit in roughly 12 hours, meaning that from the ground, they rise, move across the sky, and set in a slow and steady rhythm. This motion is constant, always repeating, always predictable. And predictability is essential here, because for GPS to work, your device must know where each satellite is supposed to be. Not by seeing it, but by calculating its position based on known orbital data. This data is part of what the satellites transmit, small pieces of information about their current position and their expected path. So even though the satellites are moving, their motion is not uncertain. It is mapped out in advance, quietly, precisely, like a schedule that is always being followed. Now imagine the Earth turning beneath this network, rotating once every 24 hours, while the satellites continue their own cycles above. The result is a constantly shifting geometry. Different satellites becoming visible, others moving out of view. But at any given moment, there are usually at least 4 satellites within range of any point on the surface. Often more than that. Sometimes 6, 8, or even 10. This redundancy is intentional. It improves accuracy and reliability. If one signal is weak or temporarily blocked, others can still be used. So the system does not depend on a single connection. It depends on a network that is always shifting, but never incomplete. Each satellite is powered by solar energy, using panels that collect sunlight continuously, storing enough energy to operate even when passing through Earth's shadow. They are designed to function for many years, quietly transmitting without interruption. Inside each satellite, there are precise instruments, including atomic clocks, which we will explore more later. For now, it is enough to know that each satellite keeps time very accurately and shares that time continuously. But before we focus on what they send, it helps to understand how they are organized. The satellites are arranged into multiple orbital planes, typically 6, each plane containing several satellites. These planes are tilted relative to the Earth's equator, which allows coverage not just around the middle of the planet, but also toward higher latitudes. This tilt ensures that even near the poles, satellites are still visible. The goal is simple: global coverage. Every location on Earth, at every moment, should have access to enough satellites for positioning. This is why the system is sometimes described as a constellation, not in the sense of stars forming pictures, but as a structured group of objects moving together, each one independent, but coordinated. Now, if you imagine standing in one place, your view of the sky is limited. You cannot see through the Earth, so only satellites above your horizon can reach you. This is why the number 24 is important. It is the minimum needed to ensure that at least 4 satellites are always visible from anywhere on the surface. More satellites improve this further, increasing the likelihood of strong signals and better positioning accuracy. But the system is not only in space. It also includes components on the ground. These ground stations track the satellites, monitor their health, and update their orbital data. They ensure that the system remains stable over time, correcting small deviations and keeping everything synchronized. So the constellation is not entirely independent. It is supported, quietly maintained. And then there is the third part, the receiver, your phone, or any GPS-enabled device. This completes the system. Space, ground, and user. 3 layers working together, without direct awareness of each other. The satellites do not know who is listening. The ground stations do not track individual users. And your device does not send signals back into space. Everything flows in one direction, from satellites to receiver. This makes the system passive from your perspective. you are not announcing your location. You are simply receiving information. Now returning to the satellites themselves. It is worth noticing how quiet their presence is. They do not appear in daily experience. You do not feel them or hear them. They leave no trace in ordinary perception. And yet, they are always there, moving above you, following their paths with steady precision. If you could see them, the sky would look different, dotted with moving points, each tracing a slow arc. But instead, the system remains invisible, which is why it often feels abstract. Something that works, but is rarely imagined. This invisibility is part of what allows GPS to feel simple on the surface. You open a map, and a dot appears. But behind that dot, there is a moving constellation, constantly adjusting. It is also important to understand that these satellites are not stationary. They are not fixed points in the sky. Their motion is essential because it allows different perspectives over time, different angles, different distances. This variation helps improve the accuracy of positioning by providing multiple geometric relationships. So the system is dynamic, always changing, but always predictable. A balance between movement and structure. If we pause here, we can see the outline of the system more clearly. Above the Earth, a network of satellites, each following a known path, each continuously sending signals. Below, receivers listening, waiting, quietly processing. And between them, empty space, through which signals travel at a constant speed. This is the structure that makes GPS possible. Not visible, but always present. And within this structure, the only thing that truly moves from satellite to receiver is information, carried as radio signals. Simple, repetitive, continuous. To understand how position is determined, we now need to look more closely at what these signals contain. Because despite the complexity of the system, the message itself is surprisingly simple. And it begins with time. Now we can rest gently on a single idea. Something simple and steady. Something that repeats without change. Each satellite is always sending a signal. And within that signal, there is one essential piece of information. A timestamp. Not a description of place. Not a map. Not instructions. Just a moment in time. The exact time at which the signal left the satellite. This is the core of the system. Everything else builds quietly on top of this. If you imagine the satellite moving along its orbit, it is constantly doing the same thing, again and again. It notes the current time, and it sends that time outward in all directions, like a steady rhythm, a repeating pulse, each pulse carrying a small piece of information. This information is encoded into a radio signal, which travels through space at the speed of light. This speed is constant, always the same, regardless of direction or location. About 300,000 kilometers per second. A number that is difficult to feel, but important to accept, because it means that the signal does not arrive instantly. It takes time to travel. A very small amount of time, but still measurable. If a satellite is about 20,000 kilometers above the Earth, then its signal takes roughly a fraction of a second to reach the surface. Not long enough to notice, but long enough to measure. And this small delay is where meaning begins to appear. Because if you know when the signal was sent, and you know when it was received, then you know how long it traveled. This difference between two moments in time is the foundation of GPS. Your device does something very quiet. It listens for these signals. And when one arrives, it compares two times. The time written inside the signal, and the time on its own internal clock. The difference between these two times tells it how long the signal has been traveling. And since the speed is known, the distance can be calculated. This process happens continuously for each satellite in view, each signal arriving, each timestamp compared, each delay measured. It is repetitive, steady, almost rhythmic, and yet it requires precision. Because the signals are moving so quickly, even a very small error in time can lead to a large error in distance. For example, if the timing is off by just 1 microsecond, that is 1/1,000,000th of a second. The calculated distance could be off by about 300 meters. A small error in time becomes a large error in space. So the system depends on measuring time very carefully, with great consistency. This is why the satellites carry precise clocks, and why synchronization matters. But we can stay with the simple idea for now. Signals are sent with timestamps. Signals are received later, and the delay between them contains information. It may help to imagine this in a more familiar way. Imagine someone far away clapping their hands, and you see the motion first, then hear the sound slightly later. The delay tells you something about the distance. Not exactly, but approximately. GPS works in a similar way, but instead of sound, it uses radio signals. And instead of rough estimation, it uses precise measurement. And instead of one source, it uses many. Each satellite is like a steady clock in the sky, marking time and sending that time outward. Your receiver collects these moments and compares them, building a set of delays. These delays are not random. They are directly related to how far away each satellite is. So without seeing the satellites, without measuring angles, your device begins to understand distance. This is the quiet shift from observing the world to measuring signals. Instead of looking outward, the system listens inward. And from listening, it constructs a picture. It is also important to notice what is not happening. The satellites are not adjusting their signals for each receiver. They are not aware of who is listening. They are simply broadcasting continuously the same signal in all directions. This means that every receiver on Earth, whether it is a phone, a car, or a navigation system, is working with the same set of signals. Each device performs its own calculations independently. So the knowledge of position is not stored somewhere central. It is created locally. Each time the signals are received. Now, if we pause here, we can summarize this gently. Satellites send time. Receivers compare time. And from the difference, distance is found. This pattern repeats again and again. Each satellite adding another measurement, another piece of the puzzle. But distance alone is not enough. Knowing how far you are from one satellite does not tell you exactly where you are. It only tells you that you are somewhere within a certain range. So the system must combine multiple distances and find where they agree. This is where geometry begins to take shape. Quietly, step by step. The timestamps become distances. The distances become relationships. And those relationships narrow down your position. All of this begins with something very small. A difference between two moments in time. So, as we continue, we will follow this idea further, watching how these measured delays turn into something more concrete. Something that can be mapped and located. Because once time becomes distance, the next step is to understand how distance becomes position. We can stay with a simple relationship. Something steady. Something that does not change. Distance equals speed multiplied by time. It is a quiet equation. Familiar. Almost obvious. And yet, in this system, it carries most of the meaning. Because once a signal leaves a satellite, it begins to travel. And it does not slow down. It does not speed up. It moves at a constant rate. The speed of light. always the same, always reliable. So, if we know how long that signal has been traveling, we can quietly convert that time into a distance. Not by guessing, but by calculation. Your receiver performs this step again and again. Each time a signal arrives, it measures the delay and multiplies by the speed of light. The result is a distance. The distance between you and that satellite at the moment the signal was sent. This distance is not visible. It is not drawn in space, but it exists as a number. A quiet measurement, precise, repeatable, and once that number exists, it begins to shape possibilities. Because if you are a certain distance from a satellite, then your position must lie somewhere within a specific region. Not anywhere, not completely unknown, but constrained, defined by that distance. To understand this gently, it helps to imagine a simpler world. Imagine a flat surface, like a quiet open field. And somewhere on that field, there is a single point, a reference point. Now imagine that you know you are exactly 10 meters away from that point. Not closer, not farther. Exactly 10 meters. Where could you be? You would not be at a single location. Instead, you would be somewhere along a circle. Every point on that circle is 10 meters away from the center. This circle represents all possible positions. Now we can slowly extend this idea into 3 dimensions. Instead of a flat surface, we imagine space. And instead of a circle, we now have a sphere. If you are a certain distance from a satellite, then you must lie somewhere on the surface of a sphere centered on that satellite. Every point on that sphere is equally valid, equally possible. This is the first step. Distance becomes a surface, a boundary of possibility. Your receiver does not yet know where you are exactly, but it has reduced the uncertainty from everywhere to somewhere on that sphere. This is already a quiet improvement. From infinite possibilities to a defined set. And this set is not random. It is structured, shaped by a single measurement. Now imagine that another satellite sends its signal. Your receiver measures its delay, converts that delay into a second distance. And now there is a second sphere, another boundary, another set of possible positions. The question becomes, where do these 2 spheres overlap? Because your position must satisfy both distances at the same time. It must lie on both surfaces. When 2 spheres intersect, they do not usually meet at a single point. Instead, They intersect along a circle. This circle represents all positions that are the correct distance from both satellites. So now the uncertainty is reduced again. From a full sphere to a ring. Still many possibilities, but fewer than before. Now imagine a third satellite. Another signal. Another delay. Another distance. And therefore, a third sphere. This third sphere will intersect with the circle formed by the first two. And in most cases, this intersection produces 2 points. 2 possible locations, both satisfying all 3 distances, both mathematically valid, but only one of them corresponds to your actual position on Earth. The other is usually far away, often not even near the surface. So, at this stage, the system is very close, but not fully resolved. It has narrowed your location down to 2 possibilities. And this narrowing happened entirely through timing. Through the simple act of measuring delays. This is the quiet power of the equation. Distance equals speed multiplied by time, repeated across multiple signals. Now there is an additional detail, one that makes the system slightly more complex. Your receiver's clock is not perfectly synchronized with the satellite clocks. Even a tiny mismatch can introduce error into all distance measurements. So the distances we have described so far are not exact. They are slightly offset, each one carrying a small error due to timing differences. This is why a 4th satellite is needed, not only to resolve the remaining ambiguity, but also to correct the clock error. But we will move into that more slowly later. For now, it is enough to stay with the geometry. Each measurement creates a sphere. Each sphere intersects with others. And with each intersection, the possible positions become fewer, more constrained, more precise. If we step back, we can see a pattern forming. Time becomes distance. Distance becomes shape. And shape becomes position. Each step building quietly on the previous one. Nothing abrupt, nothing dramatic. Just a gradual refinement. The system does not jump to a conclusion. It narrows possibilities, step by step. And this narrowing happens very quickly. So quickly that it feels instant. But underneath, there is a sequence, a process unfolding in a precise order. It is also worth noticing that these spheres are not drawn in space. They exist only in calculation. Your device is not visualizing them. It is solving equations that represent them. The intersections are computed, not observed. This makes the process efficient. and silent. No images are needed. Only numbers and relationships between numbers. Yet the idea of spheres can still help us understand, because it gives a shape to something otherwise abstract. It allows us to imagine how position emerges from distance, and how distance emerges from time. If we return briefly to the signal itself, we can notice that each one carries a timestamp, and that timestamp marks a specific moment, a point in the satellite's timeline. When that moment is compared with the receiver's time, the difference becomes meaningful. And through that meaning, space begins to take form. So, in a very quiet way, GPS is translating time into space, using a constant speed as the bridge between them. This translation is reliable because the speed of light does not change. It provides a stable foundation, something the system can depend on. And because of that stability, the calculated distances remain consistent, allowing the geometry to work correctly. If the speed were not constant, the entire system would become uncertain. But it is constant, and so the system remains steady. So far, we have built a quiet chain. Signals carry time. Time differences give delays. Delays become distances. Distances define spheres. And spheres intersect to reveal position. Each step simple. Each step precise. Each step dependent on the one before it. And all of it happening continuously, without interruption, as long as signals are received. This process continues, updating your position, refining it, maintaining it, so your location is not determined once. It is determined again and again, in a steady flow, always adjusting, always recalculating. If you move, the distances change. The spheres shift. The intersections move. And your position updates. Quietly. Continuously. Almost without delay. So even though the underlying process is layered, the result appears simple. A stable point, following your movement across a map. But that simplicity is built on repetition, on constant measurement, on the steady application of a single equation. Distance equals speed multiplied by time. And from that equation, applied many times, the system constructs a position, not directly, but through the quiet agreement of multiple measurements. This agreement is what gives GPS its reliability, because it does not rely on one signal. It relies on several, each one confirming, each one refining, each one narrowing the possibilities, until only one position remains. And with that understanding, we can begin to look more closely at how these distances are combined in a structured way. How multiple measurements come together to resolve a single point in space. And how this process is formally known as trilateration. We can now stay with the shapes that have quietly formed. Spheres, circles, and points of intersection. And we can give this process a name. Trilateration. It is a careful word, built from tri, meaning three, and lateration, meaning distance measurement. Not angles, not directions, but distances. This distinction matters because it separates trilateration from something more familiar. Triangulation. Triangulation uses angles, measuring how lines meet, how directions align. Trilateration does something quieter. It measures how far things are. And from those distances, it constructs position. We have already moved gently into this idea, but now we can walk through it slowly, step by step, beginning with one satellite. When your receiver measures a single distance, it does not know your position. It only knows that you are somewhere on a sphere. Every point on that sphere is equally possible. There is no preference, no indication of direction. This is the first state. Wide, open, unconstrained except by distance. Now we add a second satellite, a second distance, a second sphere. These two spheres meet. Not everywhere, but along a circle. And this circle represents all positions that satisfy both distances at the same time. The system has reduced the uncertainty. Not completely, but significantly. From an entire surface to a ring. Still many possibilities, but fewer than before. This is the second state. Narrower, more defined. Now we introduce a third satellite, a third measurement, and therefore a third sphere. This sphere intersects the circle formed by the first two. And in most cases, the intersection produces 2 points, 2 precise locations, both satisfying all 3 distances, both mathematically valid. And at this moment, trilateration has done something important. It has taken 3 independent measurements and reduced the possibilities to 2. Not a region, not a surface, but 2 specific points in space. This is the third state. Very close, but not fully resolved. Now, it is worth pausing here, because this moment is often misunderstood. It may seem that 3 distances should be enough. But geometry allows 2 solutions, and the system must choose between them. In practice, one of these points is usually far away, often located high above the Earth, or in an impossible position. So it can sometimes be discarded based on context. But this is not always reliable. And there is another complication, one that is more subtle. Your receiver's clock is not perfectly aligned with the satellite clocks. This creates a small timing error, and that error affects all distance measurements. Each calculated distance becomes slightly incorrect. Not by much, but enough to matter. So instead of intersecting cleanly, the spheres may not meet at exact points. They may almost intersect, but not perfectly. This introduces uncertainty, and it prevents the system from settling on a precise solution. So a 4th satellite is introduced, not just to remove ambiguity, but to correct the timing error itself. This is an important extension of trilateration. The system is not only solving for position, it is also solving for time offset. Your receiver does not assume its clock is correct. It treats the clock error as an unknown variable and solves for it along with your position. So with 4 satellites, the system has 4 equations, each one relating distance, time, and position. And from these equations, it solves for 4 unknowns. Your position in 3 dimensions, and the clock offset. This is the complete form of trilateration as used in GPS. Not just 3 distances, but 4. Working together to produce a single consistent solution. If we return to the geometric picture, we can imagine the 4th sphere intersecting with the others, not just refining position, but adjusting all distances slightly, shifting them until a single point satisfies all conditions. This point becomes your calculated position, and at the same time, the system determines how much your clock differs from the true time. This correction is applied, and the process continues. So, trilateration in GPS is not static. It is dynamic, constantly recalculating, constantly adjusting. As new signals arrive, and as your position changes, now we can slow down again and reflect on the structure of this process. It begins with measurements, simple time delays. These become distances. Distances define spheres. Spheres intersect. And through these intersections, possibilities are reduced, step by step, until only one remains. This reduction is the essence of trilateration. It does not guess. It does not assume. It eliminates what cannot be true, leaving behind what must be true. And because the measurements are repeated continuously, the solution is stable. Small errors are averaged out. Inconsistencies are corrected. And the position remains accurate over time. It is also worth noticing that trilateration does not require any knowledge of landmarks. It does not depend on maps or visual features. It relies entirely on relationships between distances and known satellite positions. This makes it universal. It works the same way anywhere on Earth. Whether you are in a city, a forest, or an open ocean. As long as signals are available, trilateration can determine position. This universality is part of its quiet strength. The same process, repeated everywhere, without variation. Now we can consider how this feels from the perspective of your device. It is continuously receiving signals, measuring delays, converting them into distances, and solving a system of equations. This happens many times per second, each solution refining the previous one. Each update adjusting your position slightly. So what appears as a stable point on a map is actually the result of ongoing computation. Always active, always resolving, and yet it remains calm, quiet, almost invisible. If we imagine this process visually, we might see spheres expanding and intersecting, shifting slightly as new measurements arrive, converging toward a single point, and holding there, even as the system continues to update. But in reality, no shapes are drawn. No images are formed. Only numbers. And relationships between numbers. This makes the process efficient and precise, but also hidden. It exists entirely within calculation. Now we can gently rest on a summary. One satellite gives a sphere. Two satellites give a circle. Three satellites give 2 points. 4 satellites give one solution. And also correct the clock. This progression is simple, but powerful. Each step reducing uncertainty. Each step bringing you closer to a precise location. And all of it built on the same quiet foundation. Measuring how long signals take to arrive. As we continue, we can look more closely at that fourth measurement. and understand why it is not just helpful, but necessary. Because without it, the system cannot fully resolve both position and time. And it is this dual solution, position and timing together, that allows GPS to function with such consistency and quiet precision. We can stay with the fourth measurement and allow it to settle gently into place. Because this step is often quiet, but essential. Without it, the system remains incomplete. Not incorrect, but unresolved. We have already seen how 3 distances narrow position down to 2 possibilities, and how geometry brings us very close. But there is still something missing. Something subtle and easy to overlook. Time inside your receiver is not perfectly aligned with time inside the satellites. This difference is small, often just a fraction of a microsecond. But because signals travel so quickly, even that small difference becomes meaningful. It changes the calculated distances. And when distances change, the geometry shifts. So the spheres we imagined earlier do not intersect exactly as expected. They are slightly offset. Not by much, but enough to prevent a clean solution. This is the quiet problem. Not position, but time. Your receiver's clock is simpler, smaller, and less precise than the clocks carried by satellites. It is designed for efficiency, not for extreme accuracy. And so it drifts. Slowly, continuously. This drift introduces a bias, a consistent offset in all timing measurements. Every signal appears slightly earlier or later than it truly is. And so every calculated distance is slightly too short or too long. If we pause here, we can see that this is not a random error. It is systematic. The same shift applied to all measurements. And because it is systematic, it can be corrected. But only if the system has enough information. This is where the 4th satellite becomes necessary. Not optional, but required. With 4 satellites, the receiver now has 4 independent measurements. 4 distances that should all agree with a single position. But because of the clock offset, they do not align perfectly. And so the system does something careful. It introduces an additional unknown. Not just your position in space, but also the amount by which your clock is wrong. This means the receiver is solving for 4 values at once: latitude, longitude, altitude, and time offset. 4 unknowns, matched by 4 equations, one from each satellite, This balance allows the system to resolve everything together, not in separate steps, but in a single calculation. The position and the clock correction emerge at the same time. This is a quiet and elegant solution. Instead of requiring a perfect clock, the system accepts imperfection and adjusts for it. It does not demand precision from the receiver. It creates precision through redundancy, through multiple measurements that can be compared and reconciled. If we return to the geometric picture, we can imagine the spheres again. But now they are slightly misaligned, not intersecting cleanly at a single point. Instead, they almost meet, forming a small region of inconsistency. The role of the fourth satellite is to allow the system to shift these spheres uniformly, adjusting their sizes slightly until they converge at one consistent point. This adjustment corresponds to correcting the clock. If the receiver's clock is running fast, the calculated distances will be too large. If it is running slow, the distances will be too small. The system detects this pattern and compensates, shifting all distances together until they align. This alignment is the solution. A point in space and a correction in time, both determined simultaneously. Now we can slow down and notice something important. GPS does not assume your clock is correct. It measures how incorrect it is and fixes it continuously. Each time a new position is calculated, the clock is adjusted again. So the receiver's sense of time becomes more accurate over time, guided by the satellites. This means GPS is not only a positioning system, it is also a time synchronization system, providing a consistent reference that devices can use to stay aligned. This aspect is often quiet, but widely used in communication networks, in financial systems, and in many other applications where precise timing matters. But for now, we can stay with the receiver, holding 4 measurements and solving for 4 unknowns. This solving process is mathematical, based on equations that relate distance to position and time. The receiver uses algorithms, often iterative, refining the solution step by step until the values converge, meaning that all equations are satisfied within a small margin of error. This happens quickly, often within fractions of a second, and it repeats continuously as new signals arrive. If more than 4 satellites are available, which is often the case, the system has even more information. additional equations that can improve accuracy. In these cases, the receiver does not simply pick 4 satellites. It uses many, combining their measurements and applying methods that minimize overall error. This makes the solution more stable and more resistant to noise. But even in these situations, the principle remains the same. Position and time are solved together through the relationship between signals and delays. Now it is helpful to pause and rest on a simple summary. 3 satellites define geometry, but 4 satellites resolve reality. Because reality includes imperfect clocks and imperfect measurements. The 4th satellite provides the extra information needed to correct these imperfections, allowing the system to settle on a single, consistent answer. If we imagine this process calmly, we might see a point in space being adjusted, moving slightly as the system refines its estimate. And alongside it, a clock being nudged, forward or backward, until both align with the incoming signals. This alignment is not permanent. It is maintained, updated continuously, because both position and time are always changing. You may move. The satellites continue their orbits, and small variations appear in the environment. So the system never stops solving. It remains active, quietly recalculating, maintaining a consistent understanding of where you are and what time it is. This dual role, position and time, is what gives GPS its reliability. Because it does not separate the two. It treats them as connected, both derived from the same measurements, both corrected together. And this connection allows the system to function even with imperfect components. A simple receiver with a drifting clock can still achieve high accuracy because the system compensates using information from space. Now we can gently step back and see the full picture forming. Signals carry time. Time becomes distance. Distances define geometry. Geometry narrows position. And with 4 satellites, both position and time are resolved together. This chain is continuous, always active, always updating, and always quiet. From the outside, it appears simple, a stable point on a map. But underneath, there is a careful balance between measurement, calculation, and correction. And at the center of this balance is the idea that time must be precise, because everything depends on it. Which leads us naturally to the next layer of the system: the clocks themselves, and how they maintain such extraordinary precision. We can now rest gently on the idea of time itself, not as something we feel, but as something that must be measured very precisely. Because in this system, time is not just a background. It is the foundation. Every distance depends on it. Every calculation begins with it. And even a small error in time becomes a large error in position. So the question becomes quiet and clear. How do the satellites keep time so accurately? The answer begins with something called an atomic clock. Not a clock with gears, not a clock with hands, but a clock based on the behavior of atoms. Inside each GPS satellite, there are one or more atomic clocks, usually based on elements like cesium or rubidium. These atoms have a natural frequency, a consistent rhythm, a way they interact with energy that repeats with extraordinary regularity. This regularity can be used as a reference, a kind of natural ticking, not mechanical, but physical at a fundamental level. If we slow down and imagine this, we can picture an atom changing state, moving between energy levels in a way that is stable and predictable. This transition happens at a specific frequency. For cesium, it is defined very precisely, and that definition is used to define the second itself. So, an atomic clock does not measure time in the usual sense. It counts cycles of a natural process. And because that process is extremely stable, the measurement becomes extremely precise. This precision is necessary because GPS requires timing accuracy on the order of nanoseconds. A nanosecond is 1/billionth of a second, a very small interval. But when multiplied by the speed of light, it corresponds to a distance of about 30 centimeters. So even a small timing error, just a few nanoseconds, can shift the calculated position by meters. And if the error grows larger, the position becomes unreliable. So the satellites must maintain time with extraordinary care. Each atomic clock provides a stable reference, and the satellite uses this reference to generate the timestamps that are sent in its signals. These timestamps are aligned with a shared system time, often called GPS time, which is maintained across the entire constellation. This shared time is consistent and does not include certain adjustments like leap seconds, making it steady and continuous. Each satellite synchronizes its clock to this system time and then broadcasts that time outward. So every signal carries not just a moment, but a moment that is consistent across all satellites. This consistency is essential because the receiver compares signals from multiple satellites. And those comparisons only make sense if the clocks agree. If one satellite were even slightly out of sync, it would introduce error into the system. So, synchronization is maintained continuously, both within each satellite and across the entire network. Now there is another quiet layer to consider: the effects of motion and gravity on time. According to relativity, time does not pass at the same rate everywhere. It can be affected by speed and by gravitational fields. Satellites move quickly relative to the Earth, and they are also farther from the Earth's center, where gravity is slightly weaker. These two effects influence the rate at which their clocks tick. One effect, due to their speed, causes their clocks to run slightly slower. Another effect, due to weaker gravity, causes their clocks to run slightly faster. These effects do not cancel perfectly. The net result is that satellite clocks would drift relative to clocks on Earth if no correction were applied. This drift would accumulate over time, leading to large positioning errors. So the system accounts for these effects. The satellite clocks are adjusted in advance, and further corrections are applied continuously, ensuring that their time remains aligned with the system time. This is a quiet example of physics being applied in practice, not as theory, but as a necessary correction, allowing the system to remain accurate. If we pause here, we can see that time in GPS is not simple. It is carefully maintained, constantly corrected, and deeply connected to both technology and physics. Yet from the outside, it appears invisible. The receiver simply reads timestamps and performs calculations without revealing the complexity behind those numbers. Now we can return to the receiver and consider how it uses this precise time. The receiver does not contain an atomic clock. It uses a simpler oscillator, which is less accurate, but sufficient when combined with the correction process we described earlier. By comparing signals from multiple satellites, the receiver estimates its clock error and adjusts accordingly. So even though the receiver's internal clock is imperfect, it becomes aligned with the more precise satellite clocks. Through continuous measurement, this is another example of the system's design. Precision is not required everywhere. It is concentrated where it matters most, in the satellites, and then shared outward, allowing simpler devices to benefit from it. Now we can slow down again and reflect on the role of atomic clocks in the larger system. They provide a stable reference, a consistent measure of time that does not drift significantly. And because of that stability, the timestamps in the signals remain reliable, which means the calculated distances remain accurate. And the geometry of trilateration remains valid. So the entire positioning system depends on these clocks. Quietly, continuously, without interruption. If the clocks were less precise, the system would still function, but with reduced accuracy. And over time, errors would accumulate, making positioning unreliable. So the clocks are not just a component. They are the foundation. Now it is also helpful to consider how these clocks are monitored. Satellites do not operate in isolation. They are part of a managed system. Ground stations track their performance, including the behavior of their clocks. If a clock begins to drift, corrections can be applied, or backup clocks can be used, ensuring continuity. This monitoring adds another layer of stability, reducing the risk of error and maintaining the integrity of the system. So the precision of GPS time is not only due to atomic clocks, but also to continuous oversight and adjustment. Now we can gently summarize this section. Satellites carry atomic clocks. These clocks measure time with extreme precision. They are synchronized to a shared system time. Corrections are applied for physical effects like motion and gravity. And the resulting timestamps are broadcast to receivers, which use them to calculate distance and position. All of this happens continuously, quietly, and reliably. And because of this, time becomes something we can depend on, not just abstractly, but practically, as a tool for locating ourselves in space. From here, we can gently shift our attention downward, from the satellites to the systems on Earth that support them, maintaining their paths, monitoring their clocks, and ensuring that the entire network continues to function smoothly. We can now gently shift our attention downward, from the satellites moving quietly above, to the surface of the Earth, where another part of the system remains mostly unseen. Not in orbit, but grounded, stable, and continuous. This is the network of ground stations, a set of carefully placed facilities spread across the planet. Each one watching, measuring, and quietly maintaining the satellites above. If the satellites are the visible structure in space, then the ground stations are the quiet support beneath them. Always active, rarely noticed, These stations do not send navigation signals to your device. They do not tell you where you are. Instead, they ensure that the satellites themselves remain accurate. Because for GPS to function, the satellites must know two things very precisely: where they are and what time it is. If either of these becomes uncertain, then every receiver on Earth would inherit that uncertainty. So, the role of ground stations is steady: to observe the satellites and to correct them when needed. We can imagine this as a quiet feedback loop. Satellites move through space. Ground stations track their motion, and adjustments are sent back upward. Maintaining alignment, maintaining accuracy, maintaining consistency. If we slow down and look more closely, each ground station is equipped with precise instruments, including its own accurate clocks, often synchronized with the same time standard used by the satellites. These stations receive signals from the satellites, just like your device does. But instead of calculating their own position, they already know exactly where they are. Their location is fixed, measured with great precision. And because of that, they can compare what they receive with what they expect. This comparison reveals small differences between the satellite's reported position and its actual position, as well as differences between the satellite's clock and the system time. These differences are usually very small, but they are important, because even a slight deviation can affect positioning accuracy on the ground. So the ground stations measure these deviations continuously, quietly building a picture of each satellite's behavior. This information is then sent to a central control system, where it is analyzed and used to generate corrections. These corrections include updates to the satellite's orbit and adjustments to its clock. Once prepared, these updates are transmitted back to the satellite, completing the loop. The satellite receives the update, applies the correction, and continues its operation, now aligned more closely with the system. This process repeats continuously, ensuring that the entire constellation remains consistent over time. If we pause here, we can notice something gentle. The satellites are not left alone once launched. They are not independent in the sense of being unmanaged. Instead, they are part of a living system, one that is monitored, adjusted, and maintained. This maintenance is quiet, often invisible, but it is essential. Without it, small errors would grow over time. Orbits would drift, clocks would lose synchronization, and the accuracy of GPS would gradually decline. So the ground stations act as a stabilizing presence, keeping the system aligned. Now we can look at another role of these stations: updating the navigation message. Each satellite broadcasts not only time, but also information about its orbit. This information allows receivers to calculate where the satellite was when it sent the signal. But the satellite's orbit is not perfectly fixed. It is influenced by gravitational forces from the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun, as well as by small effects like solar radiation pressure. These influences cause gradual changes, small shifts in position over time. The ground stations track these changes and update the orbital data accordingly. This updated data is then included in the signals sent by the satellites. So, when your receiver calculates position, it is using the most recent information available, refined and corrected through continuous observation. This process ensures that the geometry used in trilateration remains accurate, and that the calculated distances correspond to real positions in space. Now we can gently consider how this system is distributed. The ground stations are not all in one place. They are spread across different regions of the world. This distribution allows them to observe satellites from multiple perspectives. As the Earth rotates, different stations come into view of each satellite, providing continuous coverage. So no satellite is ever completely unobserved. There is always at least one station tracking it, often several. This redundancy improves reliability, ensuring that even if one station is temporarily unavailable, others can continue the work. The system remains stable, uninterrupted. Now it is helpful to step back again and see how this fits into the larger structure. Earlier, we described three parts of GPS: space, ground, and receiver. We have spent time with the satellites, and now with the ground stations, and we can see how they interact. Satellites send signals downward. Ground stations listen, analyze, and send corrections upward. And receivers listen passively, using the signals to determine position. Each part has a role. Each part supports the others. And together, they form a complete system. Now we can consider the nature of these corrections. They are not large, not dramatic, but small, precise adjustments applied regularly. This keeps the system close to its ideal state, without requiring large interventions. It is a process of continuous refinement, rather than occasional correction. And this refinement happens quietly, without interrupting the signals, without affecting the receivers. The system remains seamless from the user's perspective. Now, we can also notice that this structure allows for long-term stability. Satellites may operate for many years. And during that time, their environment changes. Their components age, and small variations appear. But the ground stations compensate for these changes, maintaining accuracy over time. This makes GPS not just a system that works now, but one that continues to work reliably over long periods, adapting quietly as conditions change. If we imagine this process gently, we might see a network of observers on Earth, each one watching the sky, measuring, comparing, and sending small adjustments back upward. And above them, the satellites continue their paths, receiving these adjustments and maintaining alignment. It is a quiet conversation between ground and space, continuous and precise. And through this conversation, the system remains stable. So when your receiver listens to the signals, it is not just hearing raw data. It is hearing information that has already been refined, corrected, and aligned. Through this ongoing process, this is why the results are reliable, and why the system can maintain accuracy across the entire planet. Now we can gently summarize. Ground stations track satellites, measure their position and time, calculate small errors, and send corrections back. These corrections keep the satellites aligned with system time and known orbits. And because of this, the signals received by your device remain consistent and accurate. This process continues without interruption, forming a quiet foundation beneath the visible system. And with this understanding, we can now return to the receiver itself and look more closely at what it does, how it listens, how it processes signals, and how it turns all of this structured information into a simple answer: your position. We can now return gently to the device near you. Small, quiet, and familiar. Your phone, or any GPS receiver. It does not look complex from the outside. It does not reveal the system it depends on. And yet, inside it, a careful process is always available. Waiting, listening, ready to determine where it is. The first thing to notice is simple. Your device does not send signals to the satellites. It does not announce its presence. It does not request its position. Instead, it listens quietly, continuously. This makes GPS a passive system from the receiver's perspective. Information flows in one direction, from satellites to device. And the device uses that information locally to calculate its position. Nothing is sent back. This is an important distinction because it means the satellites do not know where you are. They are not tracking individual receivers. They are simply broadcasting signals. And your device makes sense of those signals on its own. Now we can slow down and look at what the receiver actually does. Inside your device, there is a small component called a GPS chip, designed specifically to detect and process satellite signals. These signals are weak. By the time they reach the surface of the Earth, they have traveled a long distance and spread out in all directions. So the receiver must be sensitive, able to detect faint signals among background noise. This detection process is the first step. The receiver searches for signals from multiple satellites, identifying them and locking onto their patterns. Each satellite transmits a unique code, a sequence that allows the receiver to distinguish one signal from another. By matching these codes, the receiver knows which satellite it is listening to and can begin extracting information. Once a signal is locked, the receiver reads the data it carries. This includes the timestamp and information about the satellite's orbit. These pieces are essential. The timestamp allows the receiver to measure delay, and the orbital data allows it to calculate where the satellite was when the signal was sent. Now the receiver performs a comparison. It notes the time indicated in the signal and compares it with its own internal clock. The difference between these times gives the travel time of the signal. And from that, using the speed of light, it calculates distance. This step repeats for each satellite in view, producing multiple distance measurements. At the same time, the receiver uses the orbital data to determine the position of each satellite in space. So now it has two sets of information: the positions of the satellites and the distances to them. From here, the receiver applies trilateration, solving for its own position and clock offset. This involves mathematical equations relating distance to position and adjusting for timing error. The solution is found through computation, often using iterative methods, refining the estimate until it becomes consistent with all measurements. This process happens quickly, often in less than a second, and it repeats continuously, updating the position as new signals arrive. If the device is stationary, the calculated position remains stable, with small variations. If the device moves, the position updates following that movement. Now we can pause and notice something quiet. The receiver is not storing your position in advance. It is not retrieving it from a database. It is calculating it in real time. Each position fix is the result of a fresh computation based on current signals. This means that your location is not something the system knows ahead of time. It is something it determines repeatedly, moment by moment. This also explains why GPS can take time to initialize. When you first open a map, the receiver may need a few moments to acquire signals, lock onto satellites, and gather enough information to compute a position. This is sometimes called a cold start. Once the receiver has locked onto satellites, subsequent updates are faster because it already has some of the necessary information. Now we can consider how modern devices improve this process. Many phones use assisted GPS, which combines satellite data with information from other sources, such as cellular networks and Wi-Fi. These additional sources can provide an initial estimate of position and help the receiver identify satellites more quickly, reducing the time needed to get a fix. However, the core calculation remains the same. Signals from satellites, delays, distances, and trilateration. Now, it is also helpful to notice what the receiver does not do. It does not rely on visual input. It does not recognize landmarks. It does not interpret maps directly. All of those functions, if present, are separate from the positioning system. GPS provides coordinates, latitude, longitude, and altitude. And other parts of the device or application use those coordinates to display a map or provide directions. So the receiver's role is specific. It determines position in space. Nothing more. Now we can imagine this process gently. Signals arriving from above. Faint but steady. The receiver listening. Identifying patterns. Measuring delays. Calculating distances. And solving for position. All within a small chip. All happening quietly and continuously. If more satellites are visible, the receiver has more data and can improve accuracy. It can also detect inconsistencies, and reduce the influence of noisy measurements. This makes the system more robust, especially in environments where signals may be partially obstructed. Now we can pause again and reflect on the simplicity of the receiver's role. It listens, it measures, it calculates, and it repeats. There is no awareness, no interpretation beyond the mathematics. And yet, from this process, a clear and useful result emerges: your position. This position is then used by other systems, navigation apps, mapping tools, and services that depend on location. But the GPS receiver itself remains focused on the quiet task of determining coordinates. Now we can gently summarize. Your device receives signals from satellites, identifies them using unique codes, extracts timestamps and orbital data, measures signal delays, converts those delays into distances, and applies trilateration to determine position and time offset. This process repeats continuously, updating your location as needed. And all of it happens locally, within your device, without sending information back to the satellites. This quiet independence is part of what makes GPS reliable and widely usable. Now that we understand what the receiver does, we can begin to explore where the system is not perfect, where signals are delayed, reflected, or disrupted, and how these imperfections influence the accuracy of the position that is calculated. We can now rest gently on a simple idea. The system is precise, but not perfect. It works through careful measurement and careful correction. But it exists in a real environment where small disturbances are always present. These disturbances do not stop the system, but they influence it quietly, continuously. And understanding them helps us see the limits of GPS and how those limits are managed. We can begin with the path that the signal takes, from satellite to receiver. Earlier, we imagined this path as straight, clean, uninterrupted. But in reality, the signal passes through layers of the Earth's atmosphere, and each layer has properties that affect how the signal travels. The first layer we can consider is the ionosphere, a region of the upper atmosphere, where solar radiation creates charged particles. These particles interact with the radio signals, causing a delay. Not large, but measurable. The delay depends on factors like solar activity, the time of day, and the angle at which the signal enters the atmosphere. This means the delay is not constant. It varies. And because GPS relies on precise timing, this variation introduces error into the calculated distance. The receiver may think the signal took slightly longer to arrive, and therefore estimate that the satellite is farther away than it actually is. Now we can move slightly lower to another layer, the troposphere. This is the part of the atmosphere where weather occurs, and it also affects signal propagation. Unlike the ionosphere, the troposphere does not contain charged particles, but it does contain water vapor and variations in temperature and pressure. These factors change the refractive index of the air, slightly bending the path of the signal and slowing it down. Again, the effect is small, but it accumulates and contributes to the overall uncertainty. If we pause here, we can see that the signal's journey is not perfectly uniform. It is influenced by the environment, and these influences must be accounted for. Now we can consider another source of error, something closer to the receiver. Reflections. When a GPS signal reaches the surface, it may not travel directly into the receiver. It may bounce off buildings, walls, or the ground before arriving. This creates multiple paths. The direct path and one or more reflected paths. The reflected signals travel a longer distance, so they arrive slightly later. And if the receiver cannot distinguish between them, it may use the delayed signal, leading to an overestimation of distance. This effect is known as multipath, and it is more common in environments with many reflective surfaces, such as cities or areas with large structures. In open areas, the effect is smaller because there are fewer surfaces to cause reflections. Now we can gently notice another limitation: signal blockage. GPS signals are weak, and they do not pass easily through solid objects. Buildings, dense foliage, and terrain can block or weaken the signals, reducing the number of satellites the receiver can see. And when fewer satellites are available, the accuracy of trilateration decreases because the system has less information to work with. This can lead to larger uncertainties, or even prevent a position from being calculated at all. If too few signals are available, now we can return to the satellites themselves and consider small errors in their data. Although ground stations continuously update their positions and clocks, there can still be slight inaccuracies in the orbital information or in the timing. These inaccuracies are usually very small, but they contribute to the overall error budget. And when combined with other factors, they can influence the final position. Now we can pause again and see the pattern. Each source of error is small, often just a few meters or less, but they add together, forming a combined effect. This combined effect determines the accuracy of the GPS position. In many everyday situations, the accuracy is within a few meters, sometimes better, sometimes slightly worse, depending on conditions. Now we can consider how the system manages these imperfections. One method is modeling. The receiver uses mathematical models to estimate the delays caused by the atmosphere. These models are based on general conditions and can reduce a significant portion of the error. Although they are not perfect, they provide a useful approximation. Another method is redundancy, using signals from more satellites, allows the receiver to average out errors and identify inconsistencies, improving the overall solution. Modern receivers often track many satellites at once, increasing reliability and accuracy. There are also augmentation systems, which provide additional corrections based on measurements from ground stations. These systems broadcast correction data that receivers can use to refine their position, further reducing error. Now we can gently reflect on the nature of these corrections. They do not eliminate all error, but they reduce it, bringing the system closer to its ideal state. And because the process is continuous, the corrections are applied repeatedly, maintaining accuracy over time. Now we can consider one more subtle factor: geometry. The arrangement of satellites in the sky affects how well the receiver can determine position. If the satellites are spread out in different directions, the geometry is strong, and the position can be determined more precisely. If they are clustered together in one part of the sky, the geometry is weaker, and the uncertainty increases. This concept is often described as dilution of precision. It reflects how the geometry of the system influences the final result, even when the measurements themselves are accurate. Now we can pause and gather these ideas. Signals are delayed by the ionosphere and troposphere. They can be reflected, causing multipath. They can be blocked, reducing availability. Satellite data may have small errors, and the geometry of satellites affects precision. All of these factors combine to influence the accuracy of GPS. And yet, the system remains reliable because it is designed with these imperfections in mind. It measures, corrects, and refines continuously, adapting to conditions and maintaining a useful level of precision. If we imagine this calmly, we can see signals traveling through layers of air, bending slightly, slowing slightly, sometimes reflecting, sometimes fading, and the receiver quietly accounting for these effects, adjusting its calculations, and arriving at a position that is close to reality. Not perfect, but sufficient. Now we can gently move forward, with an understanding that GPS is both precise and tolerant. It operates within a real environment and maintains accuracy through continuous correction, which allows it to remain useful in many different conditions. And from here, we can begin to explore how this system is extended, improved, and combined with others to provide even greater accuracy and reliability in modern applications. We can now gently extend the system, not by changing its core, but by adding support around it. Because what we have seen so far is already complete. Satellites, signals, time, and trilateration. This foundation works, and it continues to work reliably. But in many situations, we want more precision. Not just meters, but sometimes centimeters. And we want more stability, especially in difficult environments. So instead of replacing GPS, engineers have built additional layers around it. Quiet improvements, subtle enhancements that refine the final result. We can begin with a simple idea: correction from nearby. Earlier, we saw that ground stations measure satellite errors and send corrections upward. But there is another approach, one that works closer to the receiver. Local reference stations. These are fixed receivers on the ground, placed at known locations. They receive the same satellite signals as your device. But because their position is already known, they can calculate the error in their own GPS solution. The difference between where they are and where GPS says they are. This difference represents the combined effect of many small errors. Atmospheric delays, satellite inaccuracies, and other factors. Now this information can be shared, with nearby receivers, allowing them to apply the same correction because the errors are often similar over short distances. This method is known as differential GPS, or DGPS. It improves accuracy by providing a local adjustment based on real measurements. If we slow down here, we can see the structure. A reference station measures error, broadcasts that error, and nearby receivers subtract it from their own calculations. This reduces uncertainty, bringing the estimated position closer to the true one. This process is simple in concept, but powerful in effect. Now we can move slightly deeper into a more precise method, one that does not just correct distances, but works directly with the signal's wave properties. This is known as real-time kinematic positioning, or RTK. In this approach, the receiver uses not only the timing of the signal, but also its phase, the exact position within the signal's waveform. By tracking the phase, the receiver can measure distances with much higher precision, down to centimeters. But this requires careful coordination between the receiver and a nearby reference station. The reference station provides a stable comparison, helping resolve ambiguities in the signal phase. This process is more complex and requires continuous communication, but it enables very high accuracy used in surveying, agriculture, and other fields where precision matters. Now we can pause again and notice the pattern. The core GPS signal remains the same, but additional information from local systems refines the result. Now we can consider another form of augmentation, one that operates over larger regions. Satellite-based augmentation systems. These systems use a network of ground stations to monitor GPS signals across a wide area. The collected data is processed, and corrections are sent to additional satellites, which then broadcast those corrections to receivers. This allows many devices across a region to benefit from improved accuracy without needing a direct connection to a local reference station. The corrections include information about satellite errors and atmospheric conditions, helping receivers adjust their calculations. Now we can gently notice how this builds a layered system. The original GPS signals provide a baseline. Local and regional systems add corrections, and together, they improve the final result without changing the fundamental process. Now we can shift slightly to another form of extension, using multiple satellite constellations. GPS is one system, but it is not the only one. There are others, developed by different regions, each with its own satellites, signals, and timing systems. Modern receivers can listen to several of these systems at once, combining their signals to increase the number of available satellites. This improves accuracy and reliability, especially in environments where some signals may be blocked. More satellites mean more measurements, and more measurements mean better solutions. Now we can pause and see how this fits into the overall idea. GPS provides a foundation, and additional systems extend that foundation, increasing precision and resilience. Now we can consider another quiet improvement: sensor fusion. Your device may not rely on GPS alone. It can also use other sensors, such as accelerometers, gyroscopes, and compasses. These sensors measure motion, orientation, and direction. When combined with GPS, they can provide a smoother, more continuous estimate of position, especially when GPS signals are weak or temporarily unavailable. For example, if you move through a tunnel, GPS signals may be lost, but the device can estimate your movement using its internal sensors and then correct that estimate once signals return. This blending of data creates a more stable experience, even though each individual source has limitations. Now we can gently reflect again. The system does not depend on a single method. It combines multiple sources, each one contributing information. And together, they produce a more accurate result. Now, we can also consider time again, not just as a measurement, but as a shared reference. Augmentation systems and multiple constellations must align their timing, or at least account for differences, so that their signals can be combined correctly. This adds complexity, but it is managed through careful design, ensuring that all parts of the system remain consistent. Now we can pause and gather these ideas. Local reference stations provide differential corrections. RTK uses signal phase for high precision. Satellite augmentation systems provide regional improvements. Multiple constellations increase satellite availability. And sensor fusion combines GPS with other measurements. All of these methods extend the core system, making it more accurate and more reliable. Now we can imagine this as layers. at the center. The basic GPS process: signals, time, and trilateration. Around it, layers of correction, refinement, and support. Each layer improving the result. Without replacing the core, this layered design allows the system to adapt to different needs. From everyday navigation to high-precision measurement. Now we can gently rest on a final thought for this section. GPS is not a single fixed system. It is a foundation that can be extended, refined, and combined with others to meet different levels of accuracy and reliability. And this flexibility is part of what allows it to remain useful across so many applications, from simple location tracking to precise measurement. And from here, we can gently move toward a broader perspective, seeing the system not just as a collection of parts, but as a continuous process, quietly running and shaping how we understand position and movement in the world. We can now let everything settle gently, not by adding something new, but by seeing the whole system as one continuous process. Not separate parts, but a quiet flow. Signals moving, time being measured, positions being resolved. Again and again. Without pause. Without interruption. We began with a simple question. How does GPS actually function? And the answer has unfolded slowly. Not as a single idea, but as a structure. Layered, precise, and quietly consistent. Satellites orbiting high above the Earth, each one carrying accurate clocks, each one broadcasting signals, not directed, not targeted, but available everywhere. Those signals traveling downward, through space, through atmosphere, carrying with them a simple piece of information: the time at which they were sent. Your receiver listening, quietly, passively, detecting those signals, identifying their sources, and measuring their arrival. The difference between sent and receive time becoming distance, and those distances forming relationships between your device and multiple satellites. These relationships narrowing possibilities, shaping geometry, and through trilateration, resolving into a single position. This process repeats continuously. Each moment, a new calculation. Each update, a refinement. So what appears as a stable point on a map is in fact a sequence of solutions each one replacing the last, each one based on fresh measurements. And at the same time, the system corrects itself. Quietly. Satellites adjust their clocks. Ground stations monitor their paths. Models estimate atmospheric delays, and receivers account for small inconsistencies. All of this happening without interruption. Maintaining alignment. Maintaining accuracy. Maintaining stability. If we pause here, we can notice something gentle. The system does not rely on certainty at any single point. It relies on repetition and correction. Small errors are allowed, but they are continuously reduced through comparison, through redundancy, through the presence of multiple signals. This makes the system resilient, not because it avoids imperfection, but because it manages it. Now we can gently widen the perspective. GPS is not just a tool for navigation. It is a system that connects time and space in a practical way, allowing devices to determine their position anywhere on Earth, using signals from above. This connection is quiet, but it shapes many aspects of modern life. Movement, coordination, synchronization, all rely on accurate positioning and timing. And yet, the process remains invisible. There are no visible lines, no markers in the sky, no indication of the calculations taking place. Only the result, a location, presented simply. Now we can reflect again on the simplicity at the core. Measure time. Convert it to distance. Use multiple distances to find position. This idea is not complicated, but its implementation requires precision, coordination, and continuous adjustment. This contrast between simple principle and complex execution is part of what makes the system stable. The foundation remains clear, even as the details become intricate. Now we can gently consider how the system behaves over time. It does not start and stop. It runs continuously. Satellites orbit. Signals are transmitted. Receivers listen. And positions are calculated. Whether or not any individual device is using it, the system remains active. A constant presence, available whenever needed. This continuity is part of its design, ensuring that positioning can be determined at any moment, without delay. Now we can pause and imagine this quietly. Above the Earth, satellites move in steady paths, each one keeping time, each one sending signals. Below, receivers wait, listening, and when needed, they calculate, bringing together information from multiple sources to determine a single point. And then, the process repeats. This repetition is calm and consistent, forming a quiet rhythm of measurement and resolution. Now we can gently revisit the idea of accuracy. The system does not claim perfection, but it achieves a level of precision that is useful, often within a few meters, and sometimes much better, with additional methods. This level of accuracy is maintained through continuous correction and through the use of multiple signals. It is not fixed, but adaptive, responding to conditions and improving when more information is available. Now we can reflect on how all of these parts connect. Atomic clocks provide precise time. Satellites broadcast that time. Ground stations maintain alignment. Receivers measure delays. Trilateration resolves position. And correction systems refine the result. Each part contributes, and none of them alone is sufficient. It is their interaction that creates the final outcome, a reliable estimate of position. Now we can gently notice something else. The system does not depend on any single path. If one satellite is unavailable, others can be used. If signals are weak, they can be combined. If errors appear, they can be corrected. This flexibility makes the system robust, able to function under varying conditions, without failing completely. Now we can rest on a quiet summary. GPS functions by measuring time, converting that measurement into distance, using multiple distances to determine position, and continuously correcting for small errors. It is a system of signals, calculations, and adjustments, working together in a steady and consistent way. And from the perspective of the user, it remains simple. A location appears and can be used without needing to see the process behind it. Now we can gently let the idea settle, not as a set of steps, but as a continuous system, always running, always resolving, and always connecting time and space in a quiet and reliable way.